Hello and welcome to the WA School of Mines Alumni Podcast. I'm Kyle D'Souza.
On today's show, we are speaking with US Consul General for Western Australia, Rachel Cook. Rachel is a career Foreign Service officer, having most recently served as the Deputy Director of the Department of State Office that oversees bilateral policy between the US and 6 Southeast Asian nations. Prior to that, she spent 5 years working on Afghanistan issues, focusing primarily on education development and media engagement, and leading joint civilian military training. Give us a little bit of your background.
I grew up in New Jersey on a barrier island off the coast in the Atlantic Ocean, basically. Yep. And because I grew up on an island, I ended up studying marine biology. I worked in fish farming for some time in rural Thailand as a Peace Corps volunteer. Mm-hmm. Then I went home and got a job with our Environmental Protection Agency. I decided I really wanted to focus on international public policy and environmental management. So I went back to graduate school for that and studied at Indiana University.
Okay, and what did you study
I
there?
Did 2 master's degrees at the same time. I did international public policy and international environmental management.
Let's just explore your time in Afghanistan. In 2008, 2009, you were the first public affairs field director in Kabul and the first US public affairs officer in Herat in 2011. How did you deal with that situation where you're in a room full of men and you're making the calls, and the community that you're working in, they perceive you as of lesser value? How did you go about dealing with that?
Luckily, I had spent almost a year in Persian language training before my first assignment in Afghanistan. My instructors were all Afghans and native speakers of Dari, which is a form of Persian. Mm-hmm. They gave us a lot of insight into cultural nuances. Most of my instructors were actually women who had grown up in Afghanistan and then moved to America during the Soviet period. I went into the country after a year of that sort of cultural immersion with these instructors. Mm-hmm. I had already served in Central Asia in very sort of male-dominated societies. Yeah. And I knew that basically I would be seen differently than local women. I could walk into a ministry office or walk into a newspaper office or a university, and they would see me honestly as an American first, and as a woman second. Certainly the language helps, though.
In terms of bringing the people on side with trying to rebuild the country, did you find it helpful that as a female you could talk directly to the other females?
It was a huge advantage that, frankly, men working in Afghanistan, most of the American male diplomats or other men who were there, didn't recognize that they were missing. I could go to women-owned businesses and go and talk with the business owners. I could go into schools that were just for girls and talk with the principal and the teachers and the girls. And I could go to women's homes. Yeah. And they would invite me into their homes, and I could learn about what's going on in their families and their communities, what's important to them. And my male colleagues couldn't do any of that. So I had access to 100% of the society there. And my male colleagues really only had access to 50%. Like, I could go into mosques and speak with the women parishioners. I could speak with the imam and say to him, this is a message that we would like you to talk with your parishioners about, right? Whatever the message was that day, maybe the upcoming elections or something like that. Yeah. And then I could go over to the side of the mosque where the women were praying, and I could sit with them and talk with them about whatever the issue was.
That's amazing.
It was amazing.
In terms of the misconceptions we have about society in the Middle East, how do you think your perceptions changed, and is society there portrayed differently by the media?
I think the first misconception is that Afghanistan is part of the Middle East. It's not solidly part of South Asia. And in fact, it's sort of cut in half. Mm-hmm. The northern part, it's kind of got these mountains that diagonally cross the country. Mm-hmm. The northern part of Afghanistan is much more like Central Asia, and the southern part of the country is much more like South Asia, Pakistan. I think that's the first sort of misconception, is to lump Afghanistan into the Middle East, because they're not really part of Middle Eastern issues. They're not an Arabic-speaking country. And while it is a Muslim majority country, they don't have the same sort of issues. They have different issues than the Middle East. I loved living there.
Yeah.
The people with whom I interacted with me because they were interested in interacting with me. Librarians and teachers and musicians and artists and journalists and government officials who were really trying to do good things, trying to instill some stability
Yeah.
and security and economic growth and education. I loved working with those people.
In the face of a full-blown war, these people somehow pick up the pieces and
Yeah, I mean, this
build
is
their lives.
a country that's basically been at war for 40 years.
Yeah.
In 1977,
Yeah.
that was basically the last year under the old royal system there, where
Yep.
there was some stability
Mm.
and economic growth. So it's been 40 years with no stability. And that means anybody who's under 45 years old doesn't remember the way it used to be. And the way it is now is normal to that. That's not normal. I talk to students a lot there. I was down in Kandahar and at a university. I was working with them to put together a radio station for the university. And I went into a classroom of students who were training to become teachers. And I said to them, the idea of stability is that your mother can ask you to run down to the market to pick up some tomatoes for dinner, and you don't have to worry, and she doesn't have to worry about the market being bombed.
Yeah.
That's stability. And that's not something they've ever known. For them, running down to the market to pick up something for dinner for their mother has a level of danger that people in other countries don't face at all.
Afghanistan, it's got tremendous potential and changes coming to these areas. How can we do it sustainably, and then how can we empower female leaders in these oppressive cultures?
So, kind of a good thing about the new Afghan constitution, and I don't know if they have this in some African countries, but is that there's a mandatory percentage of parliamentarians that are women. And so, that's not something that Australia or the U.S. have in our constitutions,
Yeah.
right? But it is something that they have because they recognized that it wasn't going to naturally happen in any time soon. And that has been working. Australia, the US, lots of other countries there have programs that specifically are targeted to encourage women to start businesses, to take scholarships, to advance in all sorts of different levels of society. So we started the American University of Kabul, and there are scholarships that are specifically for women.
Yeah.
And when I was out in Herat, it was time for the scholarship test, and so I was teaching an English class for university-age women. And so I told them all, I said, you guys should take this test. There's no harm in taking it. It doesn't cost anything. Just take it. And one of the young women got selected for a scholarship.
Wow.
And Herat is on the other side of the country from Kabul.
Yep.
It's a 2.5 hour flight. And she was excited, but she said, there's no way my parents are going to let me go. There's just no way. It's too dangerous. They don't know Kabul. We don't have relatives there. And I said, let me come home with you. Let me talk to your parents and explain to them the opportunity that you're having here. And so she took me home, and I had a lot of tea with her parents and a lot of raisins. And she got to go to the university. And from that, she graduated with a business degree, and she got a scholarship to go to the UK for a master's degree.
Wow.
And now she's back in Afghanistan as a young woman leader. And there are all sorts of women-owned and operated businesses. There's a whole radio station in Mazar-e-Sharif that's all women. Sometimes I'm asked how I operated psychologically for 2 years in a war zone. And really what I did was I actively chose to focus on what was going right and what was going well, and how I could build upon those things, and how I could empower the people doing those things to do more of those things. And
Absolutely.
that's why I loved it, because I got to work with people who were doing all sorts of fantastic things on their own. And then I could say, I see that good thing that you're doing. I have a grant for you. I have a project for you. I got to work with the blind organization that was making the Constitution of Afghanistan into Braille so that the whole blind community could read it.
Yeah.
And they wanted to do a Braille newspaper. Great. They were teaching Braille lessons to kids and stuff like that. That's fantastic.
What opportunities do you see for investment into Afghanistan? How risky is it for people to even consider it? Should we consider it?
Sure, absolutely. So even as far back as 2011, there was investment into the marble mining sector in Western Afghanistan. And so outside of Herat, there are mountains that have lots of marble in them. And there's actually an Afghan-Australian family that was originally from Herat, had moved to Australia back in the 70s. So the kids grew up here. And now those kids and their parents, so the kids are in their 40s, their 30s and 40s, invested back in Herat to open this marble mine. And I visited it in 2011, and it was very successful. For them, the biggest concern was stability, economic stability, security. Did they have a way to keep the insurgents from attacking their operation? That sort of thing. And because their family was originally from Herat, they knew lots of people there. A lot of it is who you know.
Exactly right. Absolutely.
And so that worked for them. There's also an Australian-Afghan family that invested in the media sector back there and run one of the most popular television stations that has entertainment and news and all the things that a normal television station has. And they have been successful doing that. So I know that the Chinese are interested in investing into the copper mining in Afghanistan. That was certainly being discussed when I worked there. And I think because of the stability and security issues, it's a tough time to consider investing there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you can get the right team
Yeah.
and coordinate with the government appropriately, it's doable, and there are definitely ways to make some good money and help the local communities there.
Based on your experience working in these countries where there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of risk, what 3 tips would you have for resources executives in looking at those risks and evaluating them?
Any company that's interested in operating in any other country, really the first most important thing is having a cultural understanding. At 22 years old in Thailand as a Peace Corps volunteer, I had to learn the difference between what success was in the United States and what success was in a small Thai community, and be comfortable with those differences and be not just comfortable, but happy. And so if you're a business that's going to operate in another country with another culture and another economic system or whatever, that's the most important thing to begin with, is to understand how that country operates in general. Then I recommend to everybody to reach out to their embassy, Australian High Commission, embassies around the world. The U.S. has embassies everywhere, and we're actually perfectly happy if there is no, for example, Australian High Commission there or embassy or consulate. We're happy to give insight into the local economic situation or that sector, the mining sector, and talk through issues with a potential investor. And then, if you're going to a country where that there's a risk of corruption, for us, we advise American companies that we have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which basically bans American companies from paying bribes to government officials, to private entities. It bans that. And then also the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has their anti-bribery convention. And this year it marked its 40th anniversary of that anti-bribery convention. So it's important to understand the international laws and regulations surrounding corrupt practices if you're going to a country where you think there's a risk of corruption.
That concludes part 1 of our 2-part recording with US Consul General Rachel Cook.